Kennewick Man, the Ancient One. Scientists found a human skull eroding out of the bank of the Columbia River in Washington state in 1996, and what started as a routine forensic case became a 20-year legal and scientific battle over who belongs on the American continent and who gets to decide. It was the 28th of July, 1996. Two college students attending a hydroplane race on the Columbia River near the city of Kennewick waded into the shallows and felt something hard and round beneath their feet. They pulled it out. It was a human skull. Local police were called. The initial assumption was that this was a recent event, a homicide, a drowning, an accident. Forensic anthropologist James Chatters was brought in to assess the remains. He was expecting to confirm a modern identity. Instead, he found something that stopped him immediately. The skull's shape, its proportions, the geometry of the face, did not match the population profiles he was trained to recognize for modern Native American individuals. The features were narrower in some dimensions, longer in others. Chatters noted the anomaly and continued the examination. Working carefully in the riverbed and the surrounding bank, the team recovered more bones from the same individual. And embedded in the right hip bone was a projectile point, a stone spearhead or arrowhead of a type not manufactured in the modern era. The object was fused into the bone, surrounded by healed tissue that had formed around it over the years following the injury. Whatever had struck this man, it had happened long before his death. He had survived the wound, lived with the stone lodged against his hip for years, and died of something else entirely. Carbon dating of the bone material returned a result that transformed the case completely. The individual had died approximately 9,000 years ago, placing him in the early Holocene, the period immediately following the end of the last ice age. The skull belonged to one of the oldest and most complete human skeletons ever found in North America. And from the moment that date was confirmed, nothing about the case was simple again. Legal documents found in the federal court archives of the Ninth Circuit describe one of the most unusual lawsuits in American judicial history. A case in which 8 academic scientists sued the United States Army Corps of Engineers for the right to study a 9,000-year-old skeleton. The conflict began almost immediately after the carbon dating results became public. Under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, a federal law passed in 1990 and known as NAGPRA, human remains found on federal land that are determined to be Native American must be returned to culturally affiliated tribes for reburial, if those tribes request it. 5 tribes of the Columbia Plateau region, the Umatilla, the Colville, the Yakima, the Nez Perce, and the Wanapum, filed a joint claim for the remains under NAGPRA. They referred to the individual as the Ancient One, a name reflecting their position that he was an ancestor, regardless of when he had lived, and that he deserved the same respect and burial rights extended to any other deceased member of their communities. Under their belief systems, the disruption of ancient remains was a harm to both the individual and the community, independent of any DNA relationship that science might or might not establish. The Army Corps of Engineers, which had jurisdiction over the discovery site as federal land adjacent to a managed waterway, moved to comply with the tribal request. The skeleton was placed in secure storage. Scientific access was restricted while the repatriation process proceeded. A group of 8 physical anthropologists and archaeologists filed suit in federal court to block the repatriation, arguing that the remains were of significant scientific value and that cultural affiliation had not been established under NAGPRA's legal standards. The case raised a question with no established precedent. Could a 9,000-year-old individual be legally affiliated with any modern tribal group? And if cultural affiliation could not be proven, who had the legal right to determine what happened to the oldest known human remains in the Americas? The skeleton sat in a controlled storage room at the Burke Museum in Seattle, while the courts considered the answer. Forensic analysis found, when researchers were finally permitted limited access to the Kennewick remains, a body that had lived a demanding and physically consequential life, and whose dietary habits and travel patterns were reconstructed from the chemistry of his own bones. The individual was male, estimated to have been between 38 and 50 years old at the time of death. His skeleton showed extensive evidence of physical stress and healed injury. A healed fracture of at least one rib, damage to the left elbow consistent with a significant impact, and the embedded stone point in the right hip that had been present for years before his death. He was not a man who had lived without difficulty. The dietary isotope analysis was one of the most striking findings from the scientific study. The ratio of carbon and nitrogen isotopes preserved in his bone collagen, the signature left by a lifetime of eating particular foods, indicated a diet dominated by marine mammals and anadromous fish, animals that migrate between ocean and river. This was not the diet of someone living off the interior landscape of the Columbia Basin. It was the diet of someone who had spent significant time on or near the Pacific coast. Strontium isotope analysis, which traces the geological signature of the water an individual drank during childhood, suggested he had grown up in a coastal environment. He had traveled inland, significantly inland, given that the Columbia River site, where he was found, is hundreds of kilometers from the coast. The stone point in his hip was identified as a cascade point, a type characteristic of a specific period in the prehistory of the Pacific Northwest. Cascade points were made between roughly 7,000 and 9,000 years ago. The point had been in his body long enough for substantial bone to grow around it, indicating he had lived for years after receiving the wound, a survival that, in an era without any surgical or pharmacological medicine, represented a significant physical resilience. This was a man who had been injured, recovered, traveled great distances, and lived into middle age in one of the most demanding physical environments in prehistoric North America. Journalists found, in the immediate aftermath of the Kennewick discovery, a story that was difficult to resist. Here was a 9,000-year-old man whose skull shape did not match modern Native American populations, and whose physical reconstruction bore a superficial resemblance to a European rather than an indigenous American. The facial reconstruction produced from the Kennewick skull, created using standard forensic techniques that estimate soft tissue over a bony framework, was widely circulated in the press, often accompanied by commentary noting its resemblance to the British actor Patrick Stewart. The comparison was superficial and scientifically meaningless, but it was repeated extensively and became one of the most persistent pieces of popular misinformation associated with the case. The scientific debate about what the skull morphology actually indicated was more nuanced. Physical anthropologists noted that the skull's proportions did not closely match modern Native American averages, but also did not closely match modern European averages. Some proposed similarities to the Ainu people of northern Japan, or to Polynesian populations. The honest conclusion from craniometric analysis alone was that the skull was ancient, that ancient populations looked different from modern ones, and that the technique of matching an ancient skull to a modern ethnic group was methodologically unreliable. The problem was that methodologically unreliable was not a headline. The suggestion that the earliest Americans might have been physically more similar to Europeans, and therefore that the history of who first arrived in the Americas was more contested than the standard account, was a politically charged idea that served specific narratives about indigenous land rights and the legitimacy of Native American historical claims. The only way to resolve the question was to get a DNA result, and for 15 years that proved impossible. Researchers found in 2015 that a fragment of metacarpal bone from the Kennewick hand contained enough ancient DNA to sequence, and the result ended the debate about the ancient one's ancestry in a single publication. The first attempts to extract ancient DNA from the Kennewick remains, conducted around 2010, failed. The sample preparation techniques available at that time could not recover sufficient material from bones that had spent 9,000 years in river sediment, subjected to the chemical conditions of the Columbia River environment. The results were inconclusive, contaminated, or simply absent. In 2015, a team led by Danish geneticist Esker Willerslev, whose laboratory at the University of Copenhagen had become one of the world's leading centers for ancient DNA research, was granted access to a small fragment of metacarpal bone. The Willerslev team applied a refined extraction and sequencing protocol optimized specifically for heavily degraded ancient samples. The DNA was recovered, the genome was sequenced, and the results were unambiguous. Kennewick Man's genetic profile showed closest affinities with contemporary Native American populations, specifically tribes of the American interior, including populations of the Columbia Plateau region. He was not genetically related to European populations. He was not related to Polynesian or Ainu populations. The craniometric data suggesting those connections reflected genuine morphological differences between ancient and modern human populations in the Americas, differences that disappear when the underlying DNA is read directly. Ancient people looked different from their modern descendants. That difference does not mean they were different people. The finding was published in the journal Nature in June 2015. The skull's shape had pointed toward the wrong answer. The genome pointed toward the right one. The paper explicitly addressed the legal implications, noting that the DNA results supported the cultural affiliation claims the tribal coalition had been making for nearly 20 years. Geneticists found, when they extended the comparison of Kennewick Man's DNA to specific modern tribes, that the closest match in their dataset was with members of the Confederated Tribes of the Colville Reservation, one of the tribal groups that had filed for repatriation of the remains under NAGPRA nearly 2 decades earlier. The Colville tribes are a confederacy of 12 constituent tribes whose ancestral territory encompasses a substantial portion of what is now northeastern Washington and southern British Columbia. They had been among the coalition of tribes that claimed cultural affiliation with the Ancient One from the beginning of the legal dispute, a claim the courts had declined to recognize without scientific evidence of genetic connection. The DNA comparison provided that evidence. The mitochondrial and nuclear genome data showed a specific genetic relationship between the 9,000-year-old man found in the Columbia River and living members of the Colville community, a biological thread connecting the ancient past to the present, measurable and verifiable. For members of the tribal coalition, the DNA finding confirmed something they had maintained throughout the legal proceedings. They already knew who the Ancient One was. Not because they had any specific oral tradition about this particular individual, but because the deep continuity of indigenous presence in the Columbia Plateau was not, from their perspective, a scientific question requiring external proof. It was simply the reality of their history. The Willerslev team's publication explicitly acknowledged the tribal perspective. The genetic findings aligned with what the tribes had consistently argued through 2 decades of litigation. Science, in this case, had taken nearly 20 years to arrive at a conclusion that the people most directly connected to the land had stated from the beginning. The finding also contributed to a broader scientific shift, the recognition that ancient skeletal morphology is an unreliable guide to ancestry, and that genetic analysis of ancient populations consistently reveals greater continuity with modern indigenous communities than craniometric methods had suggested. Historical records and ethnographic accounts found in academic archives document the specific reasons why the tribal coalition had opposed scientific examination of the Kennewick remains from the outset, and why the conflict between archaeological research and indigenous cultural practice was not merely a legal dispute, but a deeply held difference in how the dead are understood. The belief systems of the Columbia Plateau tribes, like those of many indigenous cultures across the Americas, hold that the human remains of the deceased are not objects of scientific interest. They are the physical remnants of people who deserve rest and whose spirits remain connected to their earthly remains until proper burial rites are completed. Disturbing those remains, handling them, analyzing them, keeping them in storage, is understood as a form of harm done to both the dead and the community to which they belonged. From this perspective, the question of whether the Ancient One was genetically related to modern tribal members was, in a sense, beside the point. He was a human being who had died in their ancestral territory. He deserved burial according to their traditions, regardless of whether a DNA test could quantify the relationship. The tribe's resistance to DNA testing was not anti-scientific. It was a statement of values. The knowledge that might be gained from studying the remains was weighed against the harm done to the dead by subjecting them to that study. The tribes consistently argued that no scientific value was sufficient to override the obligation to allow the deceased to rest. The eventual DNA analysis was conducted only after legal determinations had been made that permitted it. The tribe's concerns about the process were documented and acknowledged in the research publications. The Villeslev team worked within a framework that had been negotiated with tribal representatives to minimize the intrusiveness of the sampling. Court records found in the Federal Judiciary Database show that the Kennewick legal case wound through the American court system for nearly 20 years before a combination of the 2015 DNA findings and federal legislative action finally brought it to resolution. A resolution that rewrote the regulatory landscape for archaeological discovery in the United States. The Federal District Court had ruled in 2002 that the Kennewick remains were not subject to NAGPRA because cultural affiliation with any modern tribe had not been established. The Tribal Coalition appealed. In 2004, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals upheld the lower court's ruling, allowing scientific study to continue. The tribes petitioned for further review and continued their advocacy through political as well as legal channels. The 2015 DNA publication changed the evidentiary foundation of the dispute. The finding that Kennewick Man was genetically most closely related to Colville tribal members, one of the groups in the Repatriation Coalition, provided the scientific basis for a cultural affiliation determination that the courts had previously found lacking. In 2016, following the DNA publication and under the administration of President Barack Obama, the Army Corps of Engineers formally determined that the Ancient One was affiliated with the Tribal Coalition and ordered the repatriation of the remains under NAGPRA. The scientific advocates for continued study challenged the determination, but did not succeed in blocking it. The case established a precedent with implications beyond the United States. In Australia, Canada, and New Zealand, legal frameworks governing the treatment of Indigenous remains were subsequently examined in light of the Kennewick outcome. The principle that DNA evidence could establish cultural affiliation for repatriation purposes became part of the legal and policy conversation in multiple countries. Official records found in the Army Corps of Engineers repatriation documentation show that in February 2017, the remains known to science as Kennewick Man and to the Tribal Coalition as the Ancient One were formally transferred to the Confederated Tribes of the Colville Reservation and their repatriation partners. The transfer ceremony was held at a location that was not disclosed publicly, and the reburial site has not been made known outside the tribal community, a deliberate precaution against the possibility of unauthorized disturbance of the grave. More than 200 people attended the reburial ceremony, drawn from the 5 tribes of the coalition: the Colville, the Umatilla, the Yakima, the Nez Perce, and the Wanapum. The ceremony was conducted according to traditional practices. Specific details were not shared with the press at the request of the tribal organizers. The 21-year dispute was formally concluded. The remains that had been stored in a controlled environment at the Burke Museum were returned to the earth from which they had eroded 9,000 years after the individual's death. For the scientific community, the reburial raised questions that remain genuinely unresolved. The Kennewick remains had yielded significant information about the early peopling of the Americas, about the diet and movement patterns of ancient Pacific Northwest populations, and about the relationship between ancient and modern indigenous genetics. Further study that would now never take place, might have yielded more. What was lost, and whether the loss was justified, is a question that reasonable people in the research community continue to debate. What is not debated among those who engaged seriously with the case is that the tribal coalition's position was coherent and principled throughout, and that the DNA finding that resolved the legal question also validated their central claim. Researchers found, in reviewing the full 21-year arc of the Kennewick case, that its significance extended far beyond the specific question of one skeleton's ancestry, reaching into the foundations of how science, law, and indigenous rights intersect when ancient human remains become the subject of competing claims. The DNA findings published in 2015 did more than resolve a legal dispute. They contributed to a broader revision of the scientific understanding of how and when the Americas were populated. Kennewick Man's genome, placed alongside other ancient DNA results from the same period, helped clarify the picture of the initial peopling of the continent, a picture that continues to evolve as more ancient samples are studied. The genetic data confirmed that the ancestors of modern Native American populations had been present in the Americas for at least 9,000 years, and almost certainly significantly longer. The genetic diversity seen in ancient samples from this period, including Kennewick Man, suggests that the initial colonization of the Americas was not a single event, but a complex process involving multiple population movements and expansions over thousands of years. The legal legacy of the case was equally substantial. The Kennewick outcome clarified the interpretation of NAGPRA in ways that affected subsequent repatriation claims across the United States. Museums and universities holding indigenous remains that had previously been classified as culturally unaffiliated were prompted to re-examine those determinations in light of the Kennewick precedent, particularly as ancient DNA analysis became more widely available and more capable of establishing genetic connections that older methods could not detect. The question the Kennewick case asked, "Who belongs here and how do we know?" does not have a simple answer. But the process of asking it rigorously, with both scientific evidence and genuine engagement with the perspectives of the people most directly affected, produced something more valuable than a simple answer. It produced a more honest account of what the past actually contained.